I'm going to be covering coil springs and antique chairs. A lot of antique chairs had coil springs. This was how a lot of old people started upholstering chairs. So we got horsehair mat here. This was pretty common. Now underneath the horsehair they would put burlap, or they would use a type of muslin fabric to pull it and stretch it over top of the coil springs. But we're not going to be covering the covering part of the springs. We're going to be talking about the springs themselves and how to mount the springs. So a lot of these springs, the old people would recycle them from mattresses, old cars, anything they could find springs in. They would get them out of other seats. You'll find these springs was recycled a whole lot. Sometimes these springs was used many times over the years. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how these are put together. There's several different ways to put coil springs together to make a chair bottom. Now if you look at this one, someone's mounted it on plywood, and they've used looks like what would be called barbed wire style U-shaped nails. Now this is looks like it's been recycled from a car frame. There's part of a framing that they've sawed off, and they've took pieces of the frame and they've hammered it around it. This looks like it's probably been done in the 1950s. From the way it looks like these could be car springs, but they've cut the frame down to make this. And right here we know so, because right under here we can see where the frame has been cut and put together. This is where they would piece the frame together. Now usually they'll put a clamp here and crimp this off, or they will wrap it with a piece of wire. Just go around and around and around and wrap it real tight. But for some reason they were short on supplies, and this keeps popping loose. Now when they wrap the edge of this, the binding part, now this is like a felt here that they've used, and then this is like an upholstery. It's got a plastic feel and it's got a cloth side. Now you can use felt, you can use a plastic. I've even seen them use a lot of times wool. But all they do is they just wrap it and hand tie it with cotton thread. You can see where they've just wrapped it. But what this does is this keeps the frame from cutting in to your legs when you sit on it. When you sit down, you won't feel this frame. It protects the edges and kind of builds up the edges. And you can see where they've crimped this right here. Let's see. You can see they've used a piece of metal and rolled it around and crimped that. But there's several different ways. Now these have got springs going between the springs. Now some of these will be done with wire, and they'll be cross tied with wire. You can go from, and they should make an X all the way across. Going across the coils, there should be an X in the center of them. You can wire them in with just regular wire. They used a small gauge wire, kind of like these springs here, and they would just wire the springs in. Then at some point they went to using springs, and all they did is just curl them in, just twist it in, and they got usually the first or the second coil twisted in. But these was more adjustable if you used springs, and then they locked the springs in by pushing them down together. But these coils, you can see that they've hand put them together. It's not been made this way because if you look back here, you can see some of the coils is not fitting properly. But now the bottom is what is unique. A lot of these is put together by wiring the bottoms together and then hanging them. By hanging them on in the inside, they would put a screw or a nail and hang the whole rack on the inside of the chair. But this one, they have mounted it to a piece of plywood. This is another way we know that this has been done 50s or 60s when they was making plywood. And this is how they would put it together. Now some of these chair bottoms, you'll even see them hand tie the springs together with cotton twine, just like this right here. Now you can tie them together, but it's less effective. The twine does get old and stretch and break and come apart. I've even seen some of them be tied together with like a burlap style twine going between each coil. But you run it diagonally across the coils, and then you come back across this way. Should make an X in the center if you're doing the tied style, but if you're doing the spring style, you just curl the springs up on it, pull them together. This way when it presses down, you've got a spring from every angle, making it more flexible. I think maybe these spring styles might have came out of an old car, but I'm not real sure. It's been something that's been cut down. It's definitely not been the right size, and they've cut it down. They've had a piece of framing here, but they've ran out of framing on the sides and the back. But this is how you would wrap one. This is how you would put one together if you're trying to start from scratch and you have nothing to go by. This is one way that you can do it. There's several different ways to tie these coils in, depending on the era that you're working in. This looks like this would probably be 50s, maybe even in the 60s. Now people would recycle coil springs out of car seats, beds. They would reuse these springs out of a lot of different things, and they would just make their own frame. Either they'd take a piece of an old frame, cut it down, and just use what piece of the frames they could find, or they'd get a pencil size steel wire and they would hand bend it all the way around and crimp it all the way around. They'd crimp it together with they'd either wire tie it or they would crimp it with a round piece of metal, piece of tubular metal. They'd take it and just wrap it around it and roll it kind of like this. They just roll it around it and crimp it. Now you crimp it to each one of the springs. You can see here, one's here, and you got one here. But now on the corners, they will double up these corners. If you look under here, there's a piece of a cloth. It looks like it might be cotton fabric, but they'll just twine it in with cotton twine, wrap it around and around, build up these corners so they won't have a lot of sharpness, and when you sit down you won't be able to feel it. This is how they would do it. Now, if you got a chair and you don't know how to wind the bottom in by tying it in with wire, you can put it on a piece of plywood like this. This has been a newer style method that they've came up with, looks like. Most of it's been tied in using wire, and they just lay on the wire, and the wire just stretches out and it just hangs from the bottom of the chair. But this one, they've came up with a method of putting it on a piece of plywood, and you can see where they've put it in coil by coil and hammered them in. But they've just put the U-shape style bob wire tack in, and looks like it's worked. But there's not too much rules on putting these together. I've seen old people put these together all different ways. I guess if it works, it works. It don't matter. But most of these, this is how they would come together. Then after you would get to this spot right here, then you would wrap it either in burlap, or you wrap it in a type of cotton like muslin, and they would pull it sort of tight on the springs. They'd pull it real tight down to where it would all kind of press down evenly all the way around. Then after you put that on, then you would put the horsehair mat on top of that. And then if you're in the 50s, 60s era, if you're in the era when they was making foam, then some of them even sewed a foam padding into the top, and they would put it on the back side of your upholstery. They'd sew it in, or they would glue it into the back side of your upholstery, and then they would cover it. You'd have a sheet that went back to front, and then you would have your side panels that would be sewed on, and that's how you would wrap one of these style bottoms.